I'm going to keep track of my time and try to keep this at about 15 minutes. One, because I tend to babble and go on. Two, I'm a blatant violator of all of the PowerPoint etiquette rules. I put way too much information. I've never done one of these where I haven't had too many slides. My disclaimer is simply that think of it as a reference. So if anyone wants my slides at the end of this presentation, if anyone's doing a seminar paper on a related subject, just let me know. I'll shoot them to Professor Gervon and so forth. So I might skip through some of my slides because the intent here is not to bury you in information, but for me, they're kind of helpful talking points. Let me just say I really appreciate the chance to come out and do this. I'm just down the street, down Agate across Franklin in the research park, and my academic home is the College of Education, but my scholarly interests clearly lie at the intersection of law, policy, and education. So this is a really neat opportunity, and I would encourage you all in your law school careers to look for opportunities like this to do interdisciplinary scholarly dialogue. And it's been exciting to work with Eric, with Professor Gervon. Law school can become an insular place, as I think you all know, and so look for opportunities to break down the silos and to think more broadly, because it makes it very enriching. Let me just dive into some of my thoughts on this. I appreciate the discussion questions. I thought they were very thoughtful, and I wanted to just throw them up there to let you know the lens through which I'm looking at this. It's hard to address these in a linear fashion, so what I'm going to try to do is just try to hit on them kind of in a more circular way as I offer my comments. But those are the questions that I was given, and I think that this is an important distinction to make here, in that I would ask you to think about a continuum in a school environment where you've got everything from Billy shooting spit wads all the way up to the end of the continuum, which is walking through the door with a loaded weapon, right? And so I just want to acknowledge that I absolutely appreciate and support and respect the place of law enforcement in our civic society in terms of keeping us safe, and that's wherever, in schools, malls, wherever. What I'm going to try to do in my comments is maybe bring the plane up to about 30,000 feet and look at it from a continuum, and really ask you to think about it maybe from a constitutional lens of overbreadth, and think about where does school law enforcement fit into maintaining safety, and what are some of the dangers that maybe we've seen across the nation in terms of too much law enforcement. And I'm not here to necessarily take a side, but I do want to put out some research and some information on that point. So let's start with a Latin quiz. You all take Latin your first year, right? Who can tell me what that means? Oh, it's kind of small, I apologize. What's that?
Something about being guilty.
Sort of, yeah. Free pizza. It's let the punishment fit the crime, right? So that's a pretty, pretty long-standing notion in this idea that, it's part of justice. Is we obviously, you're all spending 3 years learning about how we've devised societal systems for making sure punishment fits the crime. So that's one thing I would put out front. The other one is, most chapter 1s of criminal law texts that I've looked at cover the theories of punishment, right? So we've got deterrence and prevention, which is, sending a message and making sure that the kids who saw the bad kid do something bad, make sure you never do that, right? We've got incapacitation, which is removal. So let's make sure that it can't happen. And, the death penalty would be an example of taking incapacitation to the extreme in terms of ending someone's life. Retribution is kind of that eye for an eye. You caused harm, and we think that you need to feel some pain and some harm along with that to kind of restore equilibrium. Education and denunciation, which is we want to talk about what this behavior is and talk about where it fits on our scale of values. So in a school environment, we want to make sure we make it clear. These are not acceptable behaviors. These are acceptable behaviors. And there's an element of shaming, too, that you can use with that model. And then rehabilitation, which is we want to address what some of the underlying causes or factors would be and remedy those. And finally, the area that I'm really interested in, my research area and some of the research projects, pilot projects I'm working on with Eric, involve restorative practices. So really looking at restorative justice as an indigenous practice, as it's been practiced for centuries, and thinking about how those kinds of practices can be embedded into an educational milieu. And I would offer that it's certainly something that school resource officers and police officers can be a part of. I think it has a lot of power. A quick quote from one of my favorite authors. I think Mark Twain was onto something back then. I think it rings true today. Education is an important part of our civic values. The Supreme Court has never gone so far as to recognize it as a fundamental right, but we certainly recognize it as an important right. If you read Brown v. Board, or you look at virtually every state in the nation has compulsory school attendance laws, and parents can be held legally liable for not having their kids in school. So we need to think about that in terms of public policy around school discipline and how the extent to which we're keeping kids in school or pushing them out. And this is just some research on, the relationship between time engaged in academic learning and long-term outcomes. And there's been lots of studies done on both the academic and the behavioral side in terms of if you're in school, if you're in the seat, your chances are good that you're going to have a positive outcome. That means graduation. The more suspensions, the more expulsions, the more contact with law enforcement you have, and it's kind of intuitive, but it's been shown empirically, the greater chances for dropout, the greater chances for ending up in the juvenile justice system. And this whole societal problem that's been coined school to prison pipeline is really what that dialogue is all about. Another research study. So I think that this school to prison pipeline issue, and one of the questions I was given was talk about zero tolerance. And I just want to say that zero tolerance is much bigger than just police services in schools or how school resource officers are practicing. It's an entire kind of paradigm that we've been engaged in this country for the last several decades. So it very much includes law enforcement, but it's bigger than that. And in order to talk about the place of law enforcement, I think it's important to talk about the whole thing, so bear with me. But if you could think about disproportionality, and if there's people in here that are interested in civil rights practice, you're concerned obviously about protecting everyone, but you're particularly concerned about protecting vulnerable subgroups, right? And we know that we can break those down by race, ethnicity, by gender, by disability status, LGBT, socioeconomic status. There's lots of different classifications that we can use to categorize. And then, of course, there's intersectionality. So you might want to take a look at students who are from a racial, ethnic minority that also happen to be students with disabilities, and to what extent those students are at risk for disproportionate harm, whatever your public policy happens to be. In this case, we're talking about school discipline. And the bottom graphic is just simply to show a decision-making continuum. So along each one of those points in a school environment, a decision has to be made, whether it's by a bus driver, a cafeteria worker, a school counselor, a teacher, a vice principal or a principal, or a school resource officer. Someone has to make a decision, and there's some discretion being employed within the framework of crime and school misconduct. What level is this, and how are we going to handle it, right? So we need to think about that in relation to disproportionality and think about how decisions affect the outcomes. So we can look at data. We can go back 40 years and look at, and again, I'm using suspension to start with here, but this is the pattern that we've been following in terms of suspending students out of school. So one of the questions posed to me was kind of talk about past practice. And the fact is we're suspending a lot more kids than we used to if you go back 40 years. And it's increasingly, you can see the trend line. And if you disaggregate that by race, you can also see that those disparities are becoming more and more marked. So if you look at black students, they're the blue columns, they've almost tripled in terms of rates of suspension in the last 40 years. This slide, again, is suspension, and it's it's kind of the same data. It's looking from comparing the 70s till now. But you're looking at the blue line, which is in the 70s, and the red line, which is now, and looking at the differences. And so that is a reflection of our practice and our public policy to some extent. And finally, this is the slide I like to call the double whammy. This is that intersectionality piece of race and disability. So if you're a student who's African American and you happen to have a disability, your chances of being suspended are 25%. So 1 in 4 kids is suspended at some point in their school career. And you can compare that to students without disabilities, and the graph on the far right is all groups. So students with disabilities are about twice as likely to receive some kind of exclusionary school discipline as students without disabilities. So that's really just a way of thinking about operationalizing this notion of disproportionality. And in the criminal justice context, it's often referred to as disproportionate minority contact. It's the same general principle. And this is basically where we sit in relation to the rest of the world, or at least the rest of the developed world. This is juvenile incarceration rate per 100,000. And this isn't just, from school stuff. This is everything. But I think for me the question this begs is, how well is that working for us as a nation, as a public policy? Are we spending less on adult prisons? Are we seeing recidivism drop? Are we seeing a deterrent effect? And are we in fact able to spend less money on prisons and more on schools? So those are the kinds of public policy questions I think legal practitioners and policymakers and researchers need to be asking at this point in the game. This is looking at now specifically referrals to law enforcement or school-related arrests. This is the Department of Ed, U.S. Department of Ed's Office for Civil Rights does a very robust data collection every other year. This year they did a universal collection, meaning it's data from every single public school in the nation, almost 100,000 districts. And so they take all that data and they compile it and they analyze it and they put it out. And we're getting better and better at getting the data into the hands of people who need to make policy decisions. But if you look down at the yellow, that represents African American students, and you can see that, it might be kind of hard. Is that hard to see? It looks a little fuzzy to me, but 16% of the enrollment, yet they make up 27% of referrals to law enforcement and 31% of school-related arrests. So you can compare that to white students who make up 51% of enrollment, but 41% of referrals to law enforcement and 39% of school-related arrests. So what I'm getting at here is that bias comes into play, and I'm not accusing anyone, teachers, police officers. This is not about accusing people of being racist. This is Eric's area of expertise, studying implicit bias and how that affects all of our civic functions, whether it's judges in courtrooms or police officers on the street or teachers in classrooms. And we need to be talking about it in a really brave way and confronting it and recognizing it and then figuring out how we can be sensitive to it, not thinking that we're going to eradicate it, but rather just really be sensitive to it and be aware that it does in fact play a role. This is looking at the disability piece then. So this is referral to law enforcement, school-related arrests. I spent many years working in special ed, a lot of which was working with kids with really challenging behaviors. Emotional behavioral disturbances, some of them diagnosed, some of them not, lots of mental health issues. And so it's I think, important for us to think about. It's obviously, you would expect that population of kids are going to have more of a higher frequency of run-ins. So thinking about how we're handling that in the context of a school environment. But essentially about double the risk, right? 12% of the enrollment, but about 25% of the school-related arrests. The school violence epidemic, this is from the National Center on Education Statistics, and there's additional data sets you can look at. This is just looking at homicide, but that's essentially going back to 1992, and it's essentially flatlined. So I think that, back to my point about we really do need to take things like Columbine and Sandy Hook and the shooting that happened here in our own backyard very serious. I absolutely support that 100%. But we also need to make sure that we're not letting the publicity that's generated from those and the emotional toll that it has on all of us guide our thinking in terms of public policy. We need to look at the data and look at the evidence and answer some questions with data and say, is there an epidemic? Are schools much more violent? Yes or no. If they're not, let's think about how we can keep kids safe, which is paramount, but also let's be very thoughtful about things like overbreadth and thinking of things through a constitutional lens and what are some of the collateral damages you have by being maybe a little too broad in terms of involving, whether it's principals making suspension decisions or police officers making decisions as to whether to issue a citation or not. I think we need to talk about the efficacy of zero tolerance. There's pretty much a mountain of evidence to suggest that it really has not made schools safer and in fact has harmed kids. So I think that school resource officers can very much be a part of a positive school climate and teach students. But I think that really comes down to the training and the philosophy that school resource officers bring into the job. Because the zero tolerance philosophy that we've been practicing has been shown pretty extensively to not work. There's really not any evidence to suggest that this one-size-fits-all, you do any number of these things and you're just out, has anything but negative effects. And I can talk more about if people want to go deeper on that issue. But if you only had time to read 2 studies and you were interested in getting your head wrapped around this issue, I would suggest these 2. One is put out by the American Psychological Association. They convened a task force in 2008 and did a really robust, extensive literature review and looked at all of the evidence, looked at the 5 underlying assumptions around zero tolerance, and examined all of them and then presented their findings. The other study was done by the Council of State Governments Justice Center in coordination with Texas A&M. And the thing that made this such a landmark study, and it was actually the study that was a catalyst for Eric Holder and the Department of Justice to team up with Arne Duncan and the U.S. Secretary of Education to say, we really need to address this school-to-prison pipeline in this country. And now we have a supportive school discipline initiative. We have 2 federal agencies really getting behind this. But this was a study where they didn't sample. They studied every single kid in Texas at a certain age cohort and followed them longitudinally for about 7 years. So they looked at 1 million kids. And the other thing that made this study interesting was they had really good integration and access to the data sets. So they had a juvenile justice database that talked really well to an education database, and they could look at all kinds of factors. And then they were able to use multivariate analyses to control for 80 plus different variables and really get to correlations and causalities between school discipline and long-term outcomes. And what they found was, and I don't have a lot of details in this slide, but if you want, I'm happy to send you the study. What they found was that relationship is inversely proportional and it increases exponentially. So the more suspension, expulsions, law enforcement engagement, the higher your chances for dropout and juvenile justice involvement and so forth. I'm running a little over time, so I'm going to move forward here a little more quickly. These are the assumptions around the APA task force that I mentioned. I think they ask some really good questions about zero tolerance and whether and to what extent it's working and appropriate. Colorado, post-Columbine, they had a pretty drastic increase in school law enforcement, and then 15 years later, they're kind of revisiting that. And again, not to say that there's not a place for law enforcement in schools, but revisiting the scope. And if you look across the nation, all of the data says pretty much the same thing. 90+% of school-based referrals to law enforcement are for things that would not qualify as behaviors that pose serious or imminent harm to people. So it's stuff like obscenity, willful defiance, vaguely defined things like that. And they're disproportionately impacting students of color and students with disabilities. So that's the danger. The danger is not, do we need to keep schools safe, and do police have a role in helping us do that? The danger is being overbroad and being really thoughtful about scope. American Bar has spoken up, if anyone's interested. The House of Delegates is the policy-making body for the American Bar. They've looked at this issue really extensively and published quite a bit on the various issues. And I like the way they frame it. We want to reduce push-out, so that's policies and practices that lead to dropout. We want to reduce kick-out, that's suspension expulsion as a response to discipline problems. And we want to reduce pullout, and that's the criminalization of school-related behavior. I think Sergeant Lewis alluded to that as well, that we're not looking to necessarily try to criminalize everything. We're there to make sure students are kept safe, and recognizing there's a line between school-related misbehavior and criminal conduct. References, if anyone's interested in that, was pretty much my spiel.
Thank you, John.